A racist cop thought he had pulled over just another black man, but what he didn't know was that this calm driver was no ordinary citizen. Within minutes, his arrogance would turn to regret, and what happens next will shock you to the core. The night was quiet, the streets nearly empty, the faint hum of traffic lights filling the silence. A sleek black luxury sedan glided smoothly down the avenue, its polished surface reflecting the glow of the street lamps. Inside the car, a dignified black man in his 50s sat upright, hands steady on the wheel, his sharp suit pressed neatly as though he had just stepped out of a courtroom. His expression was calm, his thoughts distant, until flashing red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. The siren chirped once, commanding him to pull over. He did so without hesitation, guiding the sedan smoothly to the side of the road. His face did not falter, though deep down he knew what was coming. This was not the first time he had been singled out for no reason other than prejudice. He reached calmly for his wallet and placed it on the dashboard where it could be seen, his hands returning to rest on the steering wheel, visible and still. From behind, the police cruiser screeched to a stop. A white male officer in his early 30s stepped out, his posture stiff, his stride quick. His uniform was pressed, badge shining, but his eyes carried the arrogance of someone who believed the flashing lights gave him power over anyone in front of him. He rested his hand on his belt as he approached, the other hand swinging with unnecessary force. The officer stopped at the driver's window and bent down, flashlight beaming harshly inside, even though the man had already rolled the window down. "License and registration," he barked, his tone sharp, commanding, as though he were addressing a criminal. Without hesitation, the driver spoke calmly. "Of course, officer. My license and registration are right here on the dashboard. May I hand them to you?" His voice was measured, polite, a man who understood the law as well as anyone could. The officer frowned, almost irritated by the man's composure. "Yeah, go ahead." Slowly, the driver passed the documents with steady hands, his gaze never breaking. The officer snatched them quickly and shined his flashlight across the interior of the car, scanning the leather seats, the dashboard, and the man's suit with a skeptical eye. "This your car?" the officer asked, suspicion dripping from his words. "Yes, it is," the driver replied evenly. The officer scoffed softly, glancing back at the shiny sedan as if it didn't belong to the man sitting behind the wheel. "Pretty nice ride. Doesn't look like something you'd be driving." His smirk carried insult more than curiosity. The driver said nothing, only met his gaze with calm eyes. He had learned long ago that silence often spoke louder than anger. The officer leaned closer, flashlight inches from the man's face. "Where you headed this late?" he pressed, his tone accusing. "Home," the driver replied calmly. "Is there a problem, officer?" The question, asked so politely, seemed to irritate the cop further. He shifted his weight, tapping the license against his palm. "We'll see about that," he muttered. Without another word, he turned on his heel and marched back to the cruiser. Inside the car, the driver exhaled slowly, his hands still resting on the wheel. He had endured moments like this before, moments where dignity was tested by prejudice. He knew patience was his shield. Still, deep down, he sensed tonight would be different. Something about the officer's demeanor, the arrogance in his tone, told him that this encounter would not end like the others. In the cruiser, the officer slid into the driver's seat and tossed the license onto the console. He pulled the laptop closer and began typing the name into the system, his expression still smug, as though he had already caught someone guilty of a crime. He didn't know yet, but the truth waiting on that screen would turn his arrogance into shock. Back in the sedan, the judge's eyes lingered on the flashing lights in his mirrors. They spun endlessly, painting the night in red and blue streaks. He remained calm, but his mind whispered what his heart already knew. The officer believed he held the power. Soon, that illusion would shatter, and the night would unfold into a lesson neither of them would forget. The officer sat inside his cruiser, staring at the computer screen as the system processed the driver's information. His fingers drummed impatiently against the steering wheel, his mind already racing with assumptions. To him, the expensive sedan, the late-night drive, and the confident calmness of the man behind the wheel did not fit together. In his mind, something was wrong because prejudice had already filled in the blanks. Finally, he grabbed the license and pushed open his door. His boots crunched against the pavement as he marched back toward the sedan, flashlight in hand. He approached with the same swagger, his posture radiating authority he believed was unquestionable. The driver, still sitting calmly, looked straight ahead, hands visible on the wheel. He turned his head slightly as the officer leaned down again. "You got somewhere important to be tonight?" the officer asked, his voice sharp. "Yes," the driver replied evenly. "I'm on my way home." The officer tilted his head, smirking as though the answer amused him. "Home, huh? Must be nice, driving around in a car like this. Doesn't really look like you belong in it." The words hung in the air, like a sting. The driver didn't flinch. His eyes remained steady, his voice calm. "I assure you, officer, this is my car. All of my documents are in order." But the officer wasn't satisfied. He circled the car, shining his flashlight over the polished surface, peering through the windows as if expecting to find something incriminating. He muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Returning to the window, he leaned in close. "So, what do you do for a living?" His tone was not curiosity. It was accusation, as though success was not possible without guilt. The driver's lips pressed into a faint line, but his tone remained respectful. "I work in the legal field." The officer chuckled, a low, mocking laugh. "Legal field? Huh? That's what they all say. You a lawyer or something?" The driver met his gaze. "Something like that," he answered softly. The officer scoffed again, irritated by the man's calmness. He expected fear, excuses, or at least nervousness. Instead, the driver's steady demeanor made him feel smaller, though he would never admit it. "You think you're smart, don't you?" the officer snapped. "Sitting there in your fancy suit, acting like you're better than me. Let me tell you something. You're not above the law." The driver's eyes remained fixed on him. "I never said I was officer." The answer, simple and dignified, struck harder than any argument. The officer's jaw tightened. He stepped back, pacing briefly before leaning down once more. "You know, people like you think you can just drive around and not get questioned. Well, not tonight. Tonight, I'm asking the questions." His tone was dripping with arrogance, as though he were the judge, the jury, and the law all in one. The driver inhaled deeply, his patience unwavering. "I understand you have a job to do," he said calmly, "but I assure you I have done nothing wrong." The officer narrowed his eyes, his frustration growing. He wanted control, but control was slipping with every calm response. "We'll see about that," he muttered darkly. "Step out of the car." For a brief moment, the night went silent. The driver turned his head fully now, his calm expression unshaken. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. He stepped out with grace, his tall figure standing upright under the streetlights. He looked the officer in the eye, steady and fearless. The officer searched for cracks, some sign of guilt, fear, or weakness. But all he saw was dignity, the kind that no badge could shake. "Hands where I can see them," the officer barked. The driver raised his hands slightly, not in surrender, but in clarity. "I have nothing to hide," he said softly. That calm tone, that unwavering dignity, cut deeper than defiance ever could. The officer clenched his jaw, his frustration now mingling with a strange unease. He didn't know it yet, but every word he had spoken would soon return to haunt him. The flashing red and blue lights continued to paint the night, but the balance of power was already beginning to shift. The officer still believed he was in control. The driver knew better. He knew the truth that would soon turn arrogance into regret and disrespect into humiliation. The officer's boots scraped against the pavement as he returned to his cruiser, the driver's license gripped tightly in his hand. His expression was a mixture of irritation and confidence, the kind of look carried by someone convinced they were untouchable. Sliding into his seat, he tossed the license onto the console and pulled the laptop closer. The glow of the screen lit his face as he began typing the name into the system. For a moment, his smugness remained unshaken. He believed he had the upper hand, that this stop was just another notch in his belt of authority. But as the results loaded, the first hint of doubt flickered across his face. His eyes scanned the screen once, then froze. He blinked, leaned closer, and read it again as if the words themselves couldn't possibly be real. His mouth went dry. His hands, once steady, trembled slightly against the keyboard. The name wasn't just any name. The man sitting calmly in that sedan wasn't just a lawyer, wasn't just some successful citizen driving a luxury car. No, he was a sitting judge, one of the most respected in the city, a man known for his integrity, wisdom, and influence in the courtroom. The officer's pulse quickened. His mind replayed every word he had spat out earlier, every mocking question, every insult, every arrogant command. He had belittled a judge, not just any judge, but one whose decisions shaped the law he claimed to enforce. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. Leaning back in his seat, the officer ran a hand across his face. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air. The flashing red and blue lights outside suddenly felt less like symbols of authority and more like glaring spotlights, exposing his arrogance for the world to see. He swallowed hard, picked up the license again, and stared at the name printed on it. There was no mistake, no escape, no excuse. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door and stepped back into the night. His stride, once filled with swagger, was now hesitant, unsure. He approached the sedan, slowly, each step heavier than the last. The driver was still standing calmly outside, his hands visible, his posture unshaken. He had not moved, had not flinched, as though he knew this moment was inevitable. The officer cleared his throat, forcing a shaky smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sir, he began, his voice noticeably softer than before. I ran your license. The driver's calm gaze met his, steady and unwavering. And what did you find? He asked evenly. The officer shifted uncomfortably. It seems you're, well, Judge. He said the name, his tone dripping with unease. The words caught in his throat, the title alone a reminder of how far he had crossed the line. The judge nodded once, his expression calm, almost regal. That is correct. Silence hung heavy between them. The officer forced out a nervous chuckle, scratching the back of his neck. Well, that changes things, doesn't it? He tried to sound casual, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. The judge tilted his head slightly, his eyes steady. Does it? His tone was firm, quiet, yet it carried more weight than a shout ever could. The officer swallowed hard, his earlier confidence crumbling. I didn't mean any disrespect, Your Honor. I was just... The judge cut him off, his voice calm but sharp. Didn't mean any disrespect. Officer, your words and your actions said otherwise. The officer's face flushed with shame. He opened his mouth, but no excuse came. Every arrogant remark he had made earlier echoed in his mind like a hammer striking against stone. The judge stepped closer, his calm presence towering without force. You wear a badge meant to represent justice, yet you approached me with assumptions and treated me as though I were beneath you. Tell me, officer, does that reflect the law you swore to protect?" The officer's throat tightened. His chest rose and fell quickly, his hands twitching at his sides. "No, sir," he whispered. "It doesn't." The judge's gaze didn't waver. His eyes, calm but piercing, locked onto the officer's with an intensity that stripped away every layer of arrogance. "Then perhaps tonight will serve as a reminder," he said firmly, "because you've just learned that not everyone you choose to disrespect will stay silent. Some will carry authority greater than yours, and some will choose to teach you a lesson instead of destroying you." The officer lowered his head, shame burning hotter than any reprimand from a superior could have. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him, heavier with each passing second. He realized now that the power he thought he had wielded so easily had been nothing more than a fragile illusion. For the first time that night, the officer felt small, smaller than the flashing lights, smaller than the badge on his chest, smaller than the man who stood calmly before him with dignity untouched. The balance of power had shifted. The arrogance that once filled the night had been silenced by truth. And though the officer stood there trembling, the lesson was only just beginning. The night air hung heavy between them. The red and blue lights spun silently, washing over the street in harsh flashes, but the officer no longer felt like the man in control. His earlier arrogance had dissolved into unease. The calm figure before him, judge in title, dignity in presence, stood quietly, yet his very silence carried the weight of authority the officer had only pretended to wield. The judge folded his hands calmly in front of him, his voice quiet but unwavering. "Officer, do you know what that badge on your chest truly means?" The officer blinked, caught off guard. He glanced down at the shining emblem on his uniform, then back up. It means I uphold the law, that I keep order." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes, but it is more than that. A badge is not a weapon to intimidate. It is not a crown to make you feel powerful. It is a promise that you will treat every citizen with fairness and respect. A promise that when people see you, they will feel safe, not threatened." His voice, though calm, sliced through the officer's pride like steel. The officer swallowed hard, his throat tight. I didn't see it that way," he admitted softly. "No," the judge said, his tone steady. "Tonight, you saw only the color of my skin. You saw a man in a fine car and decided he didn't belong. Instead of serving the law, you served your prejudice. That is not justice. That is arrogance." The officer shifted uneasily, shame weighing down his shoulders. "You're right," he whispered. "I was wrong." The judge stepped closer, his presence commanding without aggression. "Power," he said firmly, "does not come from flashing lights, a holstered weapon, or a badge on your chest. Real power comes from restraint, from fairness, from the ability to treat others with dignity, even when you believe they owe you none." He paused, his eyes locked on the officer's trembling expression. "That is justice. That is honor. And that is the only reason your position has value." The words hit harder than any punishment could. The officer lowered his head, unable to meet the judge's gaze. His earlier swagger was gone, replaced by humility and regret. The judge let the silence linger, allowing the lesson to sink deep. Then he added, "You are fortunate tonight. Fortunate that I am not a man who seeks revenge. Fortunate that I believe in teaching before destroying, because you have just learned something most men never do, that your arrogance can strip you of respect faster than any crime can." The officer's chest rose and fell heavily. "I understand, Your Honor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I see that now. I shouldn't have treated you or anyone that way." The judge studied him, for a long moment, his calm gaze piercing through the night. Finally, he nodded once. Understanding is the first step, but change will be the test. Remember this moment when you approach someone else on the road, someone who cannot reveal a title or a name that protects them. Remember that every person deserves respect, not just the ones who carry authority. The officer's lips trembled. He wanted to speak, to apologize again, but the words stuck in his throat. The lesson had already been delivered. Anything more he could say would only sound empty. For the first time that night, the officer realized the truth. He had not pulled over a man. He had been stopped himself, stopped by wisdom, by justice, by the weight of his own failure. The judge turned slightly, his calm presence unbroken. "I hope this will be the night you change, officer," he said softly. "Because if you do not, then your badge will mean nothing. And worse, you will harm the very people you swore to protect." The officer nodded quickly, his eyes burning. "Yes, Your Honor. I will change." The judge studied him one last time before stepping back toward his car. His movements were deliberate, dignified, the kind of presence that didn't need lights or uniforms to command respect. He slid into the driver's seat, the quiet hum of the engine breaking the silence. The officer stood frozen, his chest heavy, his mind reeling. For the first time, he understood that true authority wasn't loud, arrogant, or forceful. True authority was calm, steady, and rooted in respect. And tonight, that authority belonged not to him, but to the man he had disrespected. The lesson was over, but its weight would stay with him forever. The engine of the judge's sedan purred quietly as he adjusted his seatbelt, preparing to leave. The officer stood a few steps away, his shoulders hunched, his eyes locked on the pavement. The harsh rotation of the red and blue lights still flashed across his face, but he no longer felt the pride that once came with them. Instead, the glow seemed to mock him, reminding him of the arrogance he had worn like armor only moments ago. The judge lowered his window one final time. His calm, steady gaze met the officer's. "Officer," he said, his tone measured but firm, "remember this night. Not for who I am, but for who you should be. Every citizen deserves dignity. Every stop is a chance to honor your oath, or to betray it. Which one you choose will define the kind of man you are." The words cut deep, carving into the officer's conscience like stone. He nodded quickly, his voice unsteady. "Yes, Your Honor. I'll never forget. I promise." The judge gave one last nod. Without anger, without shouting, without vengeance, he had delivered a lesson more powerful than any punishment could bring. Then, with a calm press of his foot, the sedan rolled forward, its headlights cutting through the night as it disappeared into the distance. The red glow of its taillights grew smaller and smaller until it vanished altogether, leaving only the officer, the flashing lights, and the silence of the empty street. For a long moment, the officer remained frozen. He replayed every detail of the encounter in his mind, the mocking tone he had used, the arrogance in his questions, the false power he thought he had. Each memory was a sharp reminder of how easily he had betrayed his uniform. And yet, instead of destroying him, the man he had insulted had chosen to teach him. The realization burned in his chest. He could have lost everything that night, his job, his reputation, his future. But instead, he had been given something far greater, a chance to change. Slowly, he reached up and touched the badge pin to his chest. For the first time, it didn't feel like a symbol of power. It felt heavy, like a responsibility he had never truly understood until now. He thought about the judge's words. Respect is not given by force. It is earned through character. He shut off the cruiser's lights, and the night grew quiet again. The street fell into darkness, broken only by the glow of the moon overhead. In that silence, the officer made a vow, not just to the judge, not just to his badge, but to himself. He would change. He would no longer let arrogance guide his actions. He would remember that every stop, every encounter, was an opportunity to prove his worth, not through intimidation, but through fairness. As he slid back into the driver's seat, he exhaled deeply. The steering wheel felt different in his hands, no longer a tool of control, but a reminder of the road he had chosen, a road that demanded more of him than he had given. He thought about the countless citizens he had encountered before, the faces that blurred together in his memory. How many of them had walked away feeling humiliated, disrespected, or dehumanized because of him? The thought weighed heavy, but it also lit a fire. He couldn't change the past, but he could change tomorrow. The officer started the engine, the cruiser humming back to life. He drove slowly, his eyes fixed on the empty road ahead. But in his mind, the judge's voice echoed like a guiding star. Respect is not demanded. It is earned. From that night forward, the officer carried those words with him everywhere. Each stop, each encounter, each conversation was a test of the lesson he had been taught. And though he stumbled at times, he never forgot the night when his arrogance was shattered and his eyes were opened by the quiet strength of a man he had underestimated. The story of the racist cop and the black judge spread quietly through whispers and retellings, a cautionary tale of prejudice, arrogance, and instant regret. But for the officer, it wasn't just a story. It was a turning point, a moment that reshaped not just his career, but the man he was determined to become. And so, what began as a night of disrespect ended as a lesson in dignity, justice, and humility. The flashing lights faded, but the wisdom remained, etched into his soul forever.